je vous souhaite la bienvenue à la 4e conférence de l'année scolaire 2016-2017 du réseau en théorie internationale, International Theory Network. I'm very pleased to be able to present to you Cynthia Weber from Sussex University, very well known, I'm sure, to all of you. She has a long list of seminal publications, starting with Simulated Sovereignty back in the early 1990s, and extending to her most recent book, about which she'll be, to some extent, speaking today, Queering International Relations, obviously related to the subject of the talk. We'll also have a connection to latter-day events in the news, I suspect. Anyways, perhaps without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Cynthia, so thanks again.
Hello, bonjour, and that's the end of my French, I'm afraid. I apologize for that. Thank you very much, Kevin and Surgeon, for the invitation, and to Nisha, who's not here today, who invited me originally and tried to make things organized. And thank you, Stephanie, for all you're doing to sort out the fires. Why aren't you studying for finals? Or marking finals? I mean, there must be so many other things to do. It's delightful that so many of you are here. So I want to talk a little bit about this book today, Queer International Relations, Sovereignty, Sexuality, and the Will to Power. A Will to Knowledge. I always get the title wrong. But I want to start like this, and I also then want to end like this. And I'm going to read. I'm sorry, that keeps me on track. I've given versions of this so many times I lose my place. So here we go. On November 8th, 2016, Donald J. Trump was elected as the 45th President of the United States of America. His campaign was marked by extreme racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, misogyny, ableism, and homo, bi, transphobias. So in light of this election result, I want to depart from my usual book talk, which is where I just tell you all the details about the book and try to lay out the argument and defend it. And instead what I want to do today is certainly give you some background about what's in the book. But what I also then want to do is mobilize that analysis that I develop in the book to address two urgent questions about the Trump presidency. How did this happen? And what is to be done? I will also say that the comments that I will speak from in this respect were authored the week after Donald Trump was elected president. And so a few things have moved on, but those will just sort of feed into our conversation, I hope. Okay, so that's where I'm going. Where I'm starting is by asking a series of questions and trying to stage a conversation. So those questions and the talk generally begins like this. Oh, and I should also say I'll be doing this a lot of the time, which is to sort of suggest that things are in inverted commas or quotation marks. I'm never sure what language what means what. But any kind of identity category, that's what I mean. Okay? And also when I use the terms normal and perverse, that's what I mean. Okay? So what is homosexuality? And who is the homosexual? Queer studies scholars have long engaged with these questions, as well as with a vast array of additional questions about gender-variant, gender-nonconforming, and gender-expanding people. They've done so not to answer these questions, but to trace out what Michel Foucault calls the will to knowledge about homosexuality and the homosexual drives various hegemonic discourses of normalization. So they can focus on, for example, techniques of medicalization or psychologization or disciplinization. And while they do that, queer studies scholars demonstrate how normal and perverse subjectivities are always produced as or in relation to complex understandings of sexes, genders, and sexualities, which they read intersectionally through, amongst other things, race, class, and ability. What queer studies scholars less often do is theorize how the will to knowledge about sexualities is a specifically sovereign will that makes possible and presupposes specifically sexualized sovereign subjectivities. Doesn't mean none of them do it, it just means most of the time they don't. International relations scholars, in contrast, regard sovereignty as amongst their core concerns. This leads them to pose an alternative set of questions in their research, including things like, what is sovereignty? Who is this kind of always masculinely engendered, presumptively male figure of sovereign man? And how does that figure arrange international and national politics in a way that sovereign man presumptively authorizes that? So think about a citizenry authorizing a government, so the sovereign man. Now, Foucauldian and other critical IR scholars ask these questions not to answer them, but to trace how the will to knowledge about sovereignty and sovereign man drive various hegemonic discourses of normalization. By focusing on, for example, the social construction of nation states as sovereign, justifications for intervention in the name of sovereignty, and sovereignly authorized international economic distributions of wealth, these IR scholars demonstrate how normal and perverse international subjectivities and international orders are always produced as or in relation to complex understandings of sovereignty. But what the IR scholars less often do is theorize how the will to knowledge about sovereignty is a specifically sexualized will that makes possible and presupposes specifically sexualized sovereign subjectivities. I think you see where I'm going here, right? So queer studies scholars under-theorize sovereignty, and IR scholars under-theorize sexuality. And they do this in part because there's been a long-standing neglect of queer studies scholarship by IR scholars and a corresponding long-standing neglect of IR scholarship by queer studies scholars. The unfortunate result of this mutual neglect is that it can appear as if there is no, or there is no need for, queer theory in international relations. And it can also appear as if there is no, or there is no need for, IR theory in queer studies. So one of my aims in writing this book is to contest this proposition. And I do this by putting queer studies scholarship and IR scholarship in conversation around sexuality and sovereignty. The story I tell in this book is about how the crafting of sovereign and sexualized figures is a tool in domestic and international games of power that confirms as well as contests traditional logics of what I'll go on to explain, traditional logics of statecraft as mancraft. How many IR people do we have in here? Just curious, right? So a lot of you will know that term. I nicked that term, of course, from Richard Ashley. Rick introduced and coined this term, statecraft as mancraft, to refer to the practices that attempt to craft an agent in whose name a political community governs by investing that agent with legitimate political authority. So that sounds like a huge mouthful. It's super easy. Basically, all he's saying is that there was a medieval form of statecraft as mancraft and a modern form of statecraft as mancraft. In the medieval form, the idea was that this is monarchical sovereignty, that the authority of the sovereign came from God. And so that what the earthly person would do is like figure out some imaginary of God and then say, oh, now I got my authority from that person. Modern statecraft said, whoa, popular sovereignty. Sovereign authority comes from the people, the citizenry, okay? And it goes up, and it's their authority that gives authority to the government or the sovereign so elected sovereign officials usually. And it's this citizenry it's not exactly the same thing, but this citizenry that has that sovereign power, that now the sovereign, the elected official is like, oh, okay, now let me figure out who those people are, and I'm going to pretend I'm actually, they authorize my ability to govern. So instead of getting your authority from the top down, figuring an imaginary of God, now you get your authority from the bottom up, so you figure a particular imaginary of a citizenry or a sovereign population, and because that sovereign population is always gendered and sexualized and sexed, it's sovereign man. We can have a whole conversation about all the various engendering issues there, but that's the kind of argument in a nutshell. So by performing a close reading of modern Western theories, I only do Western theories in this, Western theories in foreign policies, I demonstrate how answers to the question, who is sovereign man, are intricately bound up with answers to the question, who is the homosexual? That's what the whole book does. Following in the footsteps of feminist and gender theorists, critical race scholars, post-colonial, decolonial, and native studies scholars who evidence how sovereign man is sexed, gendered, and racialized, often in or through colonial and or settler colonial practices, I evidence how sovereign man is also sexualized. Again, it doesn't mean none of them have done that. It means that that's my point of emphasis. And because sovereign man is a figure who is used to authorize political authority within a political community, and also to project that authority, so domestic politics, and then project that authority beyond the boundaries of the political community, international politics, this means that it's not only sovereign man who is sexualized. Formal and informal ways international relations are arranged through what IR scholars often discuss as order versus anarchy, and hopefully in lots more complicated ways than that, these are also sexualized. And so I refer to these arrangements, a very clever term here, right? It's like, how did I think this one up? Sexualized organizations of international relations. Wow, so clever. Not. So just because disciplinary IRs have been slow to recognize the role of sexuality in figuring sovereign man and organizing international relations, and I'll say more about that in a moment, this does not mean that complexly entangled relationships among sovereignty and sexuality are recent occurrences in international politics. Indeed, far from it. The argument that I make in the book is that IR theories and practices around a whole variety of theories and policies like modernization and development, immigration, terrorism, human rights, and regional and international integration rely upon, as well as construct, complex relationships of sovereignty and sexuality that participate in the sexual organization of international relations. So what I do is I spell all of that out and unpack that in the book, but generally my argument here is that by paying attention to how homosexuality and the homosexual are made meaningful and known in Western IR theories and foreign policies is one way, not the only way, but one way to help make these complex relationships of sovereignty and sexuality and their stakes, like so what, why does it matter, for IR theory and practice more apparent. Okay? So that's my project. The way I do that is I pose 4 questions about Western hegemonic discourses of IR theory and foreign policy, and I use these as my analytical focus. The first 2 questions I don't answer. The second 2 questions I do answer. The 4 questions are these. What is homosexuality? Who is the homosexual? How is the homosexual figured as or in relation to this sovereign man, this authorizing figure? And why do we care? Why are these questions relevant for IR and for queer studies? What I do is I seek to answer the last 2 of these questions. How does the homosexual participate in the figuration of sovereign man, and why should we care? By tracing how the will to knowledge, our desire to know for sure who the male homosexual is and what male homosexuality is, drives some always imagined and unstable Western discourses of sovereign statecraft to sovereign mancraft. And I also try to open up this notion of statecraft beyond just thinking about states, but also thinking about political communities other than a nation state as well. I do this by performing 4 key moves. Firstly, I stage a conversation, as I've told you, between IR scholarship and queer studies scholarship on questions of sovereignty and sexuality. The next thing I do is I set out 2 theoretical and methodological frameworks for analyzing sexualized organizations of international relations that are grounded in explorations of sexualized figurations of sovereign man. That's a big sentence. Basically what that's about is I give IR scholars and queer studies scholars a method for figuring out sexualized sovereign figures. And in those of us who are in IR, and there were lots of hands before, we know that if you don't have a method, it doesn't exist as a theory, right? So this is a legitimation exercise, okay? So don't judge me by my ISQ article, please. And then yet, yes, in terms of disciplinary facing, that's why it's there. So that's why I did that. Third, I offer a series of interlinked case studies to support my arguments, which is what the bulk of the book is about. And then finally, because you always have to do this, I try to answer the so what question. I explain the stakes for IR scholars and for queer studies scholars of considering as well as neglecting to consider sovereignty and sexuality together. Okay? So let me just explain each of these in a little bit more detail before I go on to talk about some concrete examples. Good time for some tea. All right. So I stage a conversation between IR scholarship and queer studies scholarship by reading IR insights about sovereignty with queer studies insights about sexuality. So this leads me to read, for example, queer studies critiques of developmental logics with IR as well as comparative politics, theories and policies of modernization and development theory. I can't believe we're still using modernization and development theory, but it's shocking. I was on a what I thought was a queer panel at ISA last year, and it was like modernization and development theory, and I did a lot of head scratching. I read queer migration scholarship with IR theories and policies of immigration and terrorism. And I read queer studies theories of heteronormativities, Homo Normativities, and Homo Nationalisms. I can define any of those in the Q&A if you like. With IR analyses of terrorism, human rights, and regional and international integration. The second thing I do, as I said already, is I offer these kinds of theoretical and methodological approaches for analyzing what I talk about as figurations of the homosexual, sovereign man, and sexualized orders of international relations. So what I'm doing here is I'm cribbing, in a slightly different form, Donna Haraway's notion of figuration. Figurations simply refer to the distillation of shared meanings in forms or images, and then looking at the ways in which they sometimes get materialized. She does, feminist technoscience. I'm not doing it. I'm doing a slightly different thing here. But the point is that figurations are kind of like imaginaries, but powerful imaginaries that do work in the world. So it's not about whether they're representing things properly or misrepresenting things. That's not the register of the conversation. And I go back to Foucault. Why? Because in IR, when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, nobody was if you read Foucault, it was like, oh, that's really dangerous. And now you read Foucault and everyone's like, yeah, we know Foucault, right? Everybody in IR seems to know Foucault. I was totally born in the wrong time, clearly. But then that's like, oh, okay, well, let me tell you your Foucault. Yes, you know about, Foucault on discipline and punish, and you know about what he talks about in terms of biopolitics. And there's a little bit of society must be defended, but nobody reads History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And so what I do is I draw on History of Sexuality, Volume 1, and pick up Foucault's concepts like putting sex into discourse, productive power, which IR folks think they know, and then I go back to Foucault's notion of power knowledge, right? Networks of power knowledge, and theorize it the way that Foucault does in History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which is its power, knowledge, pleasure. And I recover how the circulation of various pleasures get regulated. I also draw on Butler's notion of performativity and, of course, Rick Ashley's notion of statecraft as mancraft. And what I suggest here is that if we just use those we mix all those things together in a hopefully careful way, we can gain we can do useful analyses of figurations of the homosexual, these invented terms of the homosexual, sovereign man, and sexualized orders of IR that abide by either or logics. So you're either a friend or an enemy. You're part of the sovereign state or you're against the sovereign state. Or you're either a normal person in terms of your sexuality or you're a perverted person in terms of your sexuality. But you can't be both at the same time. Okay? All of these invented, I'm not authorizing any of these. But in terms of trying to trace how they appear in IR theories and foreign policies, you can just mix those things together and capture that. The problem is, of course, that in real life, people aren't just one thing or another. They're also often one thing and another at the same time in the same place. I experience this every time I try to use the washroom, right? This body walks into, yeah, you're seeing it. This body walks into the washroom, and to some people in there, you know, it's a little kid, it's like, are you a boy or a girl? To which I always love to answer yes. If I get in trouble. You know, to the sisters, I'm like just one of them, and it's like, hey, hi, how are you? No issue. To many other people, no issue. But you know, about 50% of the time, there will be someone in that washroom who will say, "Excuse me, sir, you're in the wrong space," or "Ah, there's a man in the washroom." Okay, all those things are happening at the same time in the same space. So what happens is that you get read as normal or perverse, as well as normal and perverse at the same time. And that doesn't just happen in the register of intimate relations or, you know, trying to use the washroom. It also happens in international relations. Are you a friend? Are you an enemy? Are you both? In what registers? How do they work? And then, of course, my project is to try to read these things together. So the reason I mention all this is because the first kind of method that I put together can capture either or logics, but it can't capture these and or logics. And also there's a whole other register of neither nor logics. You know, I'm not a boy or a girl. So, you know, that's what I really want to say. Is like, are you a boy or a girl? No. But then their brains blow up like right in front of you and their mothers get really angry. So, and that's another book. That's faking it. But the point here is that you can go back and read Roland Barthes, where he talks about the rule of the and/or, he talks about neither nor logics, and if you take that and read it back onto Rick Ashley's notion of statecraft as mancraft, you get what you move from what I describe as Rick's sort of traditional logics of statecraft as mancraft, which function in the register of the either/or, to what I try to talk about as queer logics of statecraft, which function in the registers of the and/or and the neither/nor. So why are they queer? Well, there are like innumerable ways to talk about queer. Certainly, I'm sure we have queer studies scholars in here who know this literature much better than I do. But one of the places that one of the scholars who I return to, and one of their definitions that I return to, is Eve Sedgwick's understanding of queer as a refusal or an inability to signify monolithically in relation to sex, gender, and or sexuality. So it's the refusal or the inability to be one thing or another, but you're always more than or crossed in all sorts of interesting ways. So it's this second framework that offers an additional lens through which to investigate not just these these particular figurations of the homosexual and sovereign man and sexualized orders of international relations that require a kind of what I think of as a queer logic. The third thing I do in the book is I offer a series of interlinked case studies through which I trace the ways in which sovereignty and sexuality are intertwined. The case studies, I can't really talk about the detail of them because of a lack of time, but I can tell you what they do. They span the range of what IR takes to be its core concerns and what queer studies scholars increasingly discuss in their work. If you go to an IR conference, people are like, so what do you do? State-nation formation or war and peace or IPE, right? That's like all we're allowed to do. Well, we do all of that in this book. So it's like, hey, and all of that is related to sovereignty and sexuality. Each of the case studies reads international figures, IR theories, queer theories, and foreign policies together. So for example, in the first case study, I explore how the colonialist figures of the underdeveloped and the undevelopable, I mean, these are, again, figurations, right? So fantasy figures, that are found in modernization and development theory, owe debts not just to what we've been taught in IR theory, that they come out of structural functionalist sociological theories of Talcott Parsons, but they also owe debts to how Freudian psychoanalysis linked civilizational discourses with the sexual development of the homosexual. Here, all I can do is tell you, read Neville Hode. I can give you the reference afterwards. I also then trace how the sexualized, underdeveloped, and undevelopable inform not only contemporary Western foreign policies of modernization and development theory, but how they also woven into immigration policies and terrorism policies, and even human rights policies and regional and international integration policies. Again, we can talk more about that later. The point of the case studies is that they demonstrate three things. Firstly, they demonstrate that the figure of the homosexual appears in these discourses and their corresponding public policies in three different ways. Sometimes you'll find an understanding of the homosexual that accords with Foucault's old notion of the birth of the homosexual as an alien species. Okay, as somebody who was, as a male figure who had sodomous sex with men, used to just be a sexual practice, but the Victorians decided now this is an identity category, not just an identity category, an alien species. So this is the birth of the perverse homosexual. Then we fast forward to Hillary Clinton, who sadly will not be my president, well, that's mixed, but given the choices. And how on Human Rights Day in 2011, she's like, look, gay rights are human rights, everybody, these. So we went from being an alien species with this notion of the homosexual to being another normal human being. Okay? That's a huge difference, huge difference. And it didn't just start with Hillary, but her speech legitimated it on an international stage, okay? So but you still have understandings of the perverse homosexual floating around in these policy discourses and theories. And now you also have this one. And then the one I like the most, of course, is Conchita. How many of you are Eurovision fans? Fessa. Yes, there we go, okay. So bad it's good, isn't it? Right? I mean, that's what it's all about. So how many of you know about Conchita Wurst? Okay. So Conchita Wurst was a figure who we could probably describe as queer. There's no way to really distinguish between Tom Neuwirth. I know I'm massacring his name. I'm sorry. I have a German last name, but I don't speak German. Tom Neuwirth, who is the performance artist who identifies as male, identifies as homosexual, and identifies as Austrian, and is read as white. And then Conchita, who is identified on the Conchita Wurst website as always described as she, feminine, presumptively heterosexual. She's married to Jacques de Péry. But also really interesting in relation to where this figure comes from. Not just, I'm Tom, I was born in Europe, I'm Tom in a dress, right? And also, of course, the big thing about the Conchita Wurst is it's a beautiful feminine figure with a beard, okay? But a particular kind of beard, so that's also important. But the fantasy of Conchita, the figuration of Conchita that Tom constructed, is of somebody who is from the mountains of Colombia, whose father was German and whose mother was from the mountains of Colombia, so could be Hispanic, could be indigenous, could be mestiza. Brings in all sorts of really interesting notions about transnationalisms, transracializations, transcivilizations. I mean, I don't want to authorize those terms, but the way that these things happen. So a very interesting figure. And as we know, created loads of controversy in the run-up to Eurovision and in the aftermath. On the one hand, you had people saying, people in the far right in Europe saying, Conchita is the end of Europe itself. Europe doesn't have men and women anymore, they have it. Russia used to occupy Austria. We were wrong to get out of there. Now they're all a bunch of perverts, pretty much, is what they said. On the other hand, you had Conchita being praised by some MEPs, European MEPs, invited to Brussels as Conchita to sing and to speak, and had a private audience with Ban Ki-moon at the UN. Like, right? All right. So, now, but what's really, so there are all sorts of ways then that you can think about Conchita having those kinds of notions of being from the underdeveloped world, being an immigrant to Europe, but also embodying LGBT rights. So it's what used to be read as perverse and still gets read as perverse, what now gets read as normal, LGBT stuff, or normalized, but at the same time in the same space, okay? So that's the illustration of the normal and or perverse homosexual. Now, what I find to be most interesting about Conchita, or the figure of NW as I call it, Neuwirth stroke Wirth, is that in order to actually have that, to move into the echelons of acceptable international society, all of that backstory about Conchita and Colombia disappeared. And if you read the final bios before Conchita goes to the UN, it just says Conchita Wurst was born as Tom Neuwirth, and then it gives Tom's CV. So it's like it's a complete straightening out of the queer possibilities and all of their intersectionalities in relation to Conchita. So one of the things that the case studies show then is we have illustrations of the perverse homosexual, the normal homosexual, and the normal and or perverse homosexual found in IR theories and policies. Second, they show how the figurations of the homosexual find expression in key issue areas in international relations, from development to migration to terrorism to human rights to regional and global integration. And finally, they explain how these key issue areas of international relations, how in these key issue areas, figurations of the homosexual are fused with figurations of or against variously figured sovereign man. So basically, when we're talking about, go back to the notion of Conchita, when Conchita is a pervert, right, Conchita Wurst is read as a pervert, then Europe is perverse, okay? So Europe becomes the enemy of other states. When Conchita is normal, then it's all about, okay, now this is a friend kind of network. But also that friendship, that inclusion always depends on erasing every trace to the global south, okay, and every trace of non-whiteness. Okay, so that's what these things do. Where was I supposed to go? I'm going to skip for the sake of time why this matters for international relations, and I can illustrate that in the Q&A. But one of the things I want to argue is that this was like a really horrible book to write, to go through like chapters 1 through 5, to try to go through all these horrible IR theories. They're so outdated, and all the stuff that's been left out. And I wrote the whole book only so I could do the Conchita chapter, but then even Conchita lets me down because it's so straightened, right? Or the circulation of Conchita it gets so straightened. But I think that one of the key points here is that even though for me, Conchita was like the pinnacle chapter, the arguments about sovereignty and sexuality aren't just for those of us who are Eurovision enthusiasts, and I confess to be exactly that. They're not just academic, they're not just high theory or low theory. They actually matter intensely for a lot of people in the world and how people live. And they find, and part of the reason why that happens is they find their way into policy and they find their way into everyday political conversation. I have many examples that I could offer you. For one of the examples that maybe we want to talk about in the Q&A is about the United Nations Development Program and how they're in the process of trying to put together an LGBTI inclusion index. So how do you know who the LGBTI is so you can start to measure inclusion? And what do those kinds of mechanisms and measurements do? But as I promised, what I'm going to do instead to end the talk is take you through some of the ways in which sovereignty and sexuality, I think, helped Donald J. Trump win the US presidency. Okay? So how did this happen? The Trump campaign used 3 interrelated ideas at the heart of a US conception of sovereignty to figure a particular US sovereign subject who could authorize a Trump presidency. These ideas are patriotism, the melting pot myth, and the American dream. The resulting U.S. sovereign subject the campaign figured, and this is one of the important points for this analysis, was as sexed, gendered, and sexualized as it was marked through registers of race, religion, ability or disability, and class. Rooted in Trump's long-standing politics of sexualized anti-blackness, from his stance on the Central Park jogging case, which is like, I mean, all the things just like blow your mind how stupid they are, to his spearheading of the birther movement. The Trump campaign drew heavily upon a long U.S. tradition of fear-based patriotism, which had an unfortunate resurgence in the aftermath of September 11, 2001. In addition to marking some kinds of foreigners outside the state and illegals inside the state as dangerous, fear-based patriotism groups U.S. Americans into trustworthy, loyal citizens versus risky, potentially disloyal citizens. The Trump campaign activated a version of anti-Muslim post 9/11 fear-based patriotism while expanding the scope of U.S. fears. Not only was a radical Islamic terrorism, believe me, this is all in quotes, that Trump claimed described all Muslims, including U.S. American Muslims, to be feared by U.S. Americans, and this is where he's like, let's ban all Muslims, now let's register all Muslims in the United States. The campaign drew upon a long-established historical intertwining of racisms, ableisms, misogynies, homo, bi, and transphobias, as well as religious biases, to figure the underdeveloped, the undevelopable, the unwanted immigrant, the terrorist, and some LGBTQ people as dangerous perversions of and threats to what Trump always talked about as the real America. As it did so, it cultivated anger about a loss of white male privilege, male, not as always male, but male privilege, and it refused to disavow white supremacists like the KKK who endorsed the campaign. By inciting these connections, the campaign encouraged white U.S. Americans in particular to fear, hate, and or otherwise dismiss and disparage immigrants, women, queers, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and other people of color, and the disagreeably disabled. They were also warned that progressive activists who did not share their views and career politicians who had, he literally uses the term, crippled America, were against them. These warnings were played out over and over again. I mean, if you ever read the, hashtag real Donald Trump Twitter feed, you're like, seriously, this can't be real, right? It's real. And at Trump campaign rallies. Rally anti-immigrant chants of build the wall and anti-Hillary Clinton chants of lock her up were consistently accompanied by individual comments like, fuck the, then it's the N-word here, about President Obama, and get out of here, you, and now it's the F-word about a queer person to a protester. The effect was not only to tell U.S. Americans who they should fear, distrust, dismiss, and disparage. The effect was to craft, and this is like the book, right? To craft a specific figuration of the fearful U.S. citizen who could authorize a Trump presidency. This is our sovereign man giving our authority to our leader. This fearful patriotic sovereign subject was generally a white, US-born, Anglo-Christian, heteronormative, able-bodied man or woman who was groomed to respect striding masculine forms of white authoritarian leadership, whether they came from Trump or from Russia's Vladimir Putin. And they were supposed to trust these things more than the rigged democratic process. The campaign figured the most trustworthy patriots of them all as white working class men who had presumptively been sold out by the Clintons and by President Obama. By propagating this particular form of fear-based patriotism, the Trump campaign stripped post-9/11 US patriotism of any pretense that it valued American diversity. So now I'm moving to the second point. So fear-based patriotism, now we go to the melting pot myth. So in doing this then, the Trump campaign rewrote the melting pot myth. Lots of people have rewritten the melting pot myth, but so they did it again. The melting pot myth claims US Americans value all US citizens equally, regardless of their race, religion, ethnicity, or national origin. This is what allows all U.S. Americans, and particularly immigrant U.S. Americans, to melt together into one harmonious nation. But the liberal tolerance ideology that informs the melting pot myth always allows for some U.S. Americans not to be tolerated because they are unmeltable or improperly melted U.S. Americans. And it allows U.S. leaders and ordinary citizens to change their minds about who is meltable and who is unmeltable at any time. Just go read at Donald Trump, right? So the Trump campaign explicitly marked all Muslim U.S. Americans and all Mexican U.S. Americans as intolerable and unmeltable. Whether through Trump's comments about how the Mexican heritage of a U.S. judge made him biased, or about how the silence of a Muslim Gold Star mother was an attack on the United States. These are things he said. The Trump campaign also marked many of those who bear the traces of prejudicial intersectionalities of race, religion, disability, gender, and sexuality as potentially intolerable or unmeltable. And this, and I want to use my illustration here, happened to many groups, but it happened to those people who are understood to be homosexuals. So many of those close to Trump espoused openly homophobic positions. I was writing this just 1 week after the election when people like Ben Carson, who had compared homosexuality to pedophilia and incest, was being considered to be Secretary of Education. Newt Gingrich, who had called the push for LGBTQ rights the new fascism, that's his phrase, was being considered for a senior advisor post. And the leader of Trump's domestic policy transition team, Ken Blackwell, had compared homosexuality to arson and kleptomania. I don't even know how you do that, but there we have it. And of course we have Trump's vice president, and now the vice president-elect, Mike Pence, who claimed that marriage equality will lead to societal collapse. And I think more troubling than the kind of rhetoric that you hear out of Pence has been his long-standing opposition to LGBT rights, including his signing as the governor of Indiana of a religious freedom bill, which prioritizes religious beliefs over equality for LGBTQ people. Trump, of course, has been consistently inconsistent on these kinds of issues, right? On the one hand, he claims to accept the gays, that's what he calls them, the gays, and same-sex marriage. That's like the good thing he says, right? On the other hand, he has pledged to sign the First Amendment Defense Act. That act would effectively legalize anti-LGBTQ discrimination across the board, including amongst employers, businesses, landlords, and healthcare providers, as long as they claim to be motivated by a firmly held religious belief. So basically, it's the Mike Pence law gone national. At the same time, Trump is staffing his transition team with the gay, white, male, Silicon Valley libertarian Peter Thiel. Do you know about Peter Thiel? Yeah, amazing, huh? And Trump is staffing his administration, as we know, with Steve Bannon as his chief strategist. So Thiel's disavow of what he calls the diversity myth includes having called women's experiences of rape, I'm quoting him here, seductions that are later regretted. And this is a comment that he and his co-author David O. Sachs recently apologized for, because they had to, I think. Bannon was the executive chairman of Brightbait News Network, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has called, I quote, a white ethno-nationalist propaganda. So what? Well, what all of this suggests is that while there may be a place at Trump's table for the likes of Thiel, the place of especially non-white, non-entrepreneurial, and non-male identified LGBTQ people in Trump's America is far more precarious. Not only did the campaign scapegoat unmeltable individuals and groups, it stoked anger and resentment of them and encouraged violence against them at, for example, Trump campaign rallies where he encouraged his supporters to physically attack and remove protesters. Just a little bit of tea. The campaign's dangerously vitriolic fear-based patriotism and its rewriting of the melting pot myth were accompanied now by the third thing, accompanied by an equally dangerous positive portrayal of Trump himself as the embodiment of the American dream. The American dream, and this is what a lot of people in the United States don't, I think, quite understand. They get it at a gut level, but they don't get it in a sort of bigger than that. The American dream is a sovereign dream. It tells U.S. citizens that they can become sovereign over their own destinies through individualistic wealth creation, which is as good for them as individuals as it is good for the collective U.S. sovereign states capitalist project as a whole. It's a liberal sovereign dream. So Trump seemed to appeal to white, Christian, male, working class voters in particular by acknowledging their failure to achieve or retain their American dream, and by reassuring them that their failures were the fault of domestic and foreign enemies who had stolen this dream out from under them. Domestically, these enemies were immigrants, Muslims, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and anyone else who was getting a quote-unquote unfair advantage in the politically correct rigged system, or anyone who was channeling these unfair advantages to undeserving groups. Internationally, it was countries like China, who Trump described as raping the U.S. through its trade practices. Oh my gosh, I mean, like, have you read the news? We're in such trouble. With the help of career politicians like the Clintons, who Trump blamed for the neoliberal trade agreement, NAFTA, which, by the way, more Republicans voted for than Democrats, but facts, right? By portraying himself as the politically incorrect, self-made, ruthless, art of the deal, bullying businessman who, like them, knew who America's real enemies were, Trump not only convinced these mainly white voters he was on their side, he persuaded them that he alone could, quote, make America great again, exclamation point. That's the title of the book. Exclamation point is there. By, for example, championing protectionist trade policies that he claimed, of course wrongly, but would bring manufacturing jobs back home. And at the same time, Trump convinced middle class and upper class, mainly white voters, that the economic benefits of neoliberalism that they had long enjoyed would continue and be accompanied by further tax cuts for them under a Trump administration. So what I think happened here is that the more Trump employed misogynistic, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, anti-Mexican, anti-black rhetoric in his campaign, the more his base seemed to embrace him as the maverick genius they needed to stand up for the real America and to restore U.S. white, sometimes male, entitlement. This means that Trump did not win the presidency in spite of his vile comments and vile behavior toward women, the gays, the blacks, the Mexican rapists, the radical Islamic terrorists, all in quotes. He won the presidency because of and/or in spite of these comments and actions, and because of how his campaign mobilized them to create a coalition of fear-based, misogynistic, Christian, patriotic whiteness. There are other factors that account for the election, right? Like nobody liked Clinton, or deeply unpopular, the FBI letter, the Voting Rights Act having been gutted. All of these things were, and of course the way the Electoral College system functioned. I mean, Hillary is now ahead by well over 2 million in the popular vote count, but she lost the Electoral College. So I'm not saying that every Trump voter consciously identified with Trump's bigoted, chauvinistic structures of understanding and social relations of power that were legitimated and further embedded in the U.S. because they voted for Trump. Nor is this to say that Clinton's brand of neoliberalism was by any stretch of the imagination an ideal alternative to what the Trump campaign proposed. It too used all sorts of ways of mobilizing sex, gender, and sexuality with race, religion, class, and ability to configure a differently contentious U.S. sovereign subject. My point is this, that sex, gender, and sexuality played crucial roles in making Trump's U.S. sovereign subject a figure who was appealing to and who could be inhabited by, that's the performativity notion, inhabited by mostly, but not exclusively, white US Americans. Now, crucially, the Trump campaign didn't just roll out its vision of this US sovereign subject by employing these either-or logics that I talked about earlier. Even though much of the time it did seem to be like that. I mean, certainly the Trump campaign pitted trustworthy versus untrustworthy US citizens against one another. But Trump himself consistently flip-flopped on who these trustworthy and untrustworthy citizens were, especially in the case of women, the blacks, and the first black president of the United States. And the campaign, of course, rolled out Mike Pence to deny many of the things that Trump said. Trump also made a lot of inherently contradictory statements that he suggested, that suggested he was for some groups and against some groups or policies at the same time. I mean, this is one of my favorites, especially again in the Register of Sexuality, quoting Trump. "There can be no discrimination against gays. I'm against gay marriage." End of quote. Now, I can see a way that that could be possible, but I don't think that's the way he means it, right? And then he says in his 60 Minutes interview that gay marriage is a legally settled issue. He also said many inconsistent things about the anti-trans bathroom bills in North Carolina. It's like, oh, these are terrible. Well, you understand why the businesses need them. So comments like these were implicitly and explicitly made in the Register of Sex, Gender, and Sexuality throughout the campaign. And they were more consistent with and/or logics, right? So being one thing or another and one thing and another at the same time, in the plural, and, or, as well as neither nor logic. No, I didn't say that, right? Every Saturday Night Live skit, I'm not apologizing, I'm apologizing, right? I would never do that. Than they were with either or logics. So these statements, I think, demonstrate how some of the paradoxical figures and logics found in queer discourses were co-opted by the Trump campaign for its own purposes. Okay. And so I can talk about, I think I should stop because there's too much to say and I've been going on for too long. But I can also talk about the question of what do we do and how do we go on from here. But I guess the general point I want to end with is that I think that sexuality and sovereignty are about what we do every day. In all sorts of ways in which we inhabit intimate spaces, familial spaces, friendship groups, neighborhoods, states, and international politics. And that IR hasn't theorized these seriously and hasn't thought about the implications for how they become real in people's lives means that IR is missing a trick. If IR scholars are arguing that we as IR scholars, those of us who are IR scholars, can adequately explain state and nation formation, war and peace, and international political economy, by leaving all this stuff out, we're wrong. Okay? On the other hand, though, I think that queer studies scholars who particularly those who are doing global and transnational queer studies, who neglect IR theory, don't get the whole picture either. So my argument is that, well, these are there are lots of IRs and lots of queer studies, but the kinds of literatures that I've talked about and written about are really rich and really important, but I think that they are even richer and more important when they're thought together rather than thought apart. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Cynthia, for this amazing, wide-ranging talk. So many details, so much to think about, and such an interesting analytical framework for us to ponder. I guess we'll try to open up the floor to questions, and maybe feel free to point people out.
Okay, and I should say I have like no memory whatsoever, so I have to take questions one at a time. Unless I completely have no idea how to answer, then you'll see me taking more than one. Yes?
There was a meeting about a month ago at Ottawa City Hall. I'll name the people who were there and make it, but I'll be very short. Bernie Ferber represented Jewish people. I forget the man's name, but Reverend Bailey, but I forget his first name, but from Jamaica, and I'm sure you'd easily find him. There was a police officer, Ottawa police officer, and again his name I forget, Joanne Law. I'm not sure. She won many awards here in Ottawa and in Canada, but she is a transsexual as far as I can see. And Almira Al-Ghawabi was representing Islam. And it was about, there was a rash of hate speech and hate symbols being done to the church at that place. The only connection I can make with your topic, Joanne Law, she said in her opening statement was gender-neutral toilets are the tip of an iceberg of a social revolution. I don't know if she said that just to catch people's attention, but maybe I could ask if she's, what her follow-up 5-minute speech was about, sexuality and, but didn't develop that. But is it such a big thing? I can make a question like that. Is this gender-neutral toilet issue the tip of the iceberg of a great change in society?
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. I can actually engage with that. I don't have to go to the next. I think there are all sorts of, I wasn't at that meeting. I don't know most of the people, I don't know any of the people that you just talked about, so I can't speak in any specific way. But I think that one of the things that your question gets at is the question of whether or not things like sex, gender, and sexuality are natural phenomena that we're born with, or are they socially constructed? Are they things that get figured through, how we live our lives? Are there some kinds of combinations? And do we need to know, right? So one of the things that, one of the reasons why this book is called Sovereignty, Sexuality, and the Will to Knowledge is about how very often that notion of the desire to know for sure about someone's gender, someone's sex, someone's sexuality, jams us up all the time, okay? And we impose it so often in our initial impressions of people. The way that we impose it, most of the time, is as an either-or logic, a binary. You're either male or female, you're either straight or gay, you're either cisgendered or transgendered. And yet, what happens, so the tip of the iceberg, when you get to conversations about gender-neutral toilets, the idea is also, I mean, I don't know what these people were talking about, but I can tell you about other conversations I've had, is that, well, do we really need to know someone's gender identification for them to use a washroom? And then it makes us ask, do we need to know their gender identification in other things? There was a really interesting story a colleague told at a conference I was at not long ago, where she was in a hotel room and there was a problem with some technology in the hotel room, and the person came to the door to help correct the problem, and basically they couldn't identify her gender. And I say her because that's how she identifies. And there was this conversation back and forth where they couldn't get to the sorting out the technology because the attendant kept going, sir, ma'am, ma'am, sir, and she didn't help them. She let them kind of just implode in this kind of mess, right? And she was reflective about it. She was like, okay, there's a class dynamic here. There are all sorts of other things. We can't just read these things in one way or another. But the question that it raised, and it goes to your question, is, do you need to be able to gender me in order to fix my television? Right? That was the kind of... So that, I think, speaks to that notion of the tip of the iceberg. And it goes into ideas about how, gender and sexuality aren't necessarily one thing or the other. People talk about spectrums. People talk about, bowl of spaghetti, right? I mean, there are all sorts of different metaphors out there, but very different than just you walk through this door or you walk through that door. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
I was just wondering, I'm not an IR scholar, But it would seem that there's an interesting conversation to be had between kind of the Halberstam stuff on the art of failure,
Yeah.
and IR people are interested in failure, I assume, as well. Is that something that you sort of address in the context of this book?
I don't. I make reference to Jack Halberstam wrote a book called The Queer Art of Failure, and it's a book that I teach in my global queer class. My students love it, and what it talks about is how what Jack is trying to do is think about how failure might inherently be a queer performance. And I guess where I differ and I'm kind of critical about that particular formulation, I can see how it can be helpful in some cases. I don't think queer is inherently anything. I think that that's an imposition. Well, just because as a queer person I fail to be able to use the restroom, for example, the washroom, in any consistent way. And usually my partner, I'll go in with my partner, and the first thing we say as we approach a restroom is talking. And so that because I'm in conversation with a woman who is read as a woman, I'm now reread as a woman, and then it works. But I'm not sort of celebratory of these things, and I don't think there's an inherent connection between queerness and failure. What about all sorts of other kinds of failures? And also, what about, my major concern is we're still working on the opposition between success and failure. And I think we need to escape that binary. I wrote about this a little bit in a piece called Why Is There No Queer International Theory? I don't know if anybody's looked at that piece. And in that piece, I talk about how one of the reasons why IR scholars push queer studies away is because there's a particular disciplinary understanding of success. And there are ways in which one can make the argument that queer theory is successful. It can help us be more successful. And that's the only story I think disciplinary IRs can hear. If you tell them a story about, and look, watch us fail, okay? That's funner. It's a lot more fun. But it doesn't, there are different projects at different moments. So I don't want to take anything away from Jack and their move about queer failure. But I guess the thing that, for this particular project, I was self-consciously aware that this was a disciplinary legitimating project. My intention in writing this book and giving these talks is to valorize for particularly the discipline of international relations the value of queer theory. And why? So that my PhD students will get jobs. So that when they get jobs, they'll get promoted. And I've adopted you should see me at ISA. It's like everybody's my PhD student. So assistant professors get tenured, so that queer people actually make it into the ranks of professors. Those kinds of things. So these were a series of very strategic pieces that that weren't going to embrace the failure notion because of that political project. But then again, in the other conversation, but I can't go there anyway because I see it as too binary. So that's my idiosyncratic, but that's a good, you've been trying to get into the conversation.
For a long time.
For a long time.
Dr. Weber, thank you for being here today. I'm very grateful for the work that you are doing and for the University of Ottawa for hosting you and creating a space where these discussions can be had. I'm an MA student in a competing program at Carleton University. Exactly, right? And we are still on chapters 1 to 5 of your book over there, and that's why I'm really happy to be here today. But I just want to get to the crux of my question is your last question, what is to be done? I have a question of consciousness raising and a question of how do we change institutional culture to legitimize queer theory in the IR Academy, because where we're at right now, Foucault is still dangerous over there. And what's happening? What's going on? Why are we in the 1980s? But that's a different matter.
Oh, only in the 1980s.
If only.
I was actually writing in the 1980s. Yeah.
The best of times and the worst of times. Before I was born. My question is,
really?
What is the effort of how do we do battle in the trenches?
Yeah, how do we do battle in the trenches? Okay, excellent question. It's not a competition, by the way, and I'm glad they're even on chapters 1. So that's amazing. Okay, that this book is even being read in IR is shocking to me. Seriously, and so I'm really happy about that. My strategy is, and again, it sort of speaks a little bit to what the gentleman just left said. It's not do one thing. It's not you got to do it my way. It's we got to do everything. Okay, so there are all sorts of different strategies. So I think it's fantastic that Jack is talking about queer failure and doing it in the circles that they're doing it in, and that works. So there are all sorts of different kinds of mobilizations that one can make. This particular mobilization happens to be a facing the discipline mobilization. It's a facing the discipline mobilization. Why? Because clearly you've pointed out how old I am. What else am I going to do with a professorship? What's a professorship for? And so it should be about authorizing other people, not pulling the gate up. Okay, but it doesn't mean that everyone. I hope that Raoul Rao is an amazing queer scholar in IR and development studies and law. And he once said, I said recently at a public event, that I'm glad Cindy does this stuff she does so nobody else has to. I don't want to do it, right? Don't do this. It doesn't have to be done. It's about then do what you want to do. One of the reasons why I also wrote this book is back in the 1990s I wrote a book called Faking It. That was all about neither nor logics. And it was supposed to be funny. I was amused. That was a big mistake. And I was shunned for that book. And the discipline of IR did not get it at all. And I think that book, now 15 years later, people are like, oh, this is a classic. It's like, really? You should have been there 15 years ago. Okay? So it's also about trying to read what the political times are that you're in. So yeah, Foucault might still be dangerous, but they know who Foucault is. And you can start to expand the conversations in different ways, or you can just drag them ahead. So, I think that on the one hand, like a book like Faking It and those kinds of queer writings I was doing in the 1990s were important because I was young enough to be, in my understanding of the discipline, I was stupid. I was tone deaf. I had no idea what I was doing. I was writing for me. Okay? And I think that we all ought to have moments of writing for ourselves. I think we can't wait for the discipline or disciplines of IR. And I had as much trouble with the feminists as I had with the post-structuralists as I had with the mainstreamers, although I have to say Rick Ashley was the exception. He was like, I love this book. I was like, oh. But he was my supervisor, so. But I still thought he'd hate it. You can't wait for the discipline to catch up. You shouldn't wait. You shouldn't just do, for God's sake, don't just do what's in chapters 1 through 7. Okay, throw the book away, or use the book to get your foot in the door, and then do something, critique it, or ignore it, or step on top of it, or step on top of me. That's the point, okay? And I think that's what I can do, and you can do far more interesting things than I can do. We could talk specifics about networks and strategies, but I do think that one of the pieces of advice that I got as a PhD student was you write your first book to get a job and to get tenure. Now I don't know how many books you need to get tenure, but that used to be the way it was. And then you wrote your second book for yourself. So Simulating Sovereignty, that was my PhD thesis rewritten as a book. That made my career. And then Faking It unmade my career. Not smart, but it's a different world. So look around and see what's going on. For me, I also think that one of the things that interests me, is what's going on in the world. Is how, apart from the way I don't know how you talk about it here in Canada, but in the United Kingdom where I work and live. It's in university. It's all about the impact agenda, right? Your work has to have an impact in the world, and then they measure that and they take all the impact out of it. So screw the impact agenda, but do think about, life is short. Why are you doing what you're doing, and what difference will that make in the world? And where are you positioned in the world so that you can be heard by particular audiences where you couldn't be heard before? I mean, you can do, I'm sure you can do things that I can't do, but I'm sure I can do things that you can't do. So it's do everything. And the other thing I think is also don't compete. This should not be about, you know, who's got the longest CV or who's got the best program, Carleton or Ottawa. I know that's not what you're saying. But I think that that's one of the ways that disciplines are structured. And we have to take the zero-sumness out of this, and we have to recognize that all marginalized people need to be the priority for all of us. Okay? So it's not the queers against, you know, the list of Donald Trump, you know, caricatures here. Everybody has to, you know, if you've got a critical perspective, you've got a particular political agenda, you have to support everyone as best you can. I think that's the main thing. You have to help the underdog. You in the back. Is that okay?
I work for the Department of Foreign Affairs, so I'm looking at IR theory in practice. And one thing I wanted to talk about was what you said about this vision of moving from, you know, the pervert to the human being. And I think one danger we see in our power structures that are all talking about IR and IR practice and talking about how you respond to conflict and all those things is that you sort of add the LGBT and stir, and what you get is the replicated power structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So white, gay, male,
absolutely.
presents as male, presents as able-bodied.
That's right.
So that's one challenge we saw in the U.S. Randy Berry was the LGBT envoy. In my own department, we see who the ones are that are, the Prime Minister just appointed here an LGBT special advisor who's also from that echelon. So, I mean, I wanted your comments on that replication of privilege, even when a society claims that it's moving forward with all of the LGBTQ, etc.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. It's really important that you bring that up. Sorry. This is what some queer scholars talk about as Homo Normativity. So that what happens is that we go from an understanding of what's called heteronormativity, where those things that are associated with heterosexual lifestyle sort of normalized, you know, male, female, make your kids and have your little life kind of understand. You don't, it's more complicated than that, but sort of there are particular sort of those kinds of heteronormative norms, those straight norms, that necessarily understand some people as outside of it. So those could be single moms who are straight, but they can also, but there are all the queers are out, okay, and all the homosexuals are out of that. And then what happens is we move from, so we have an understanding of the homosexual there as a perversion, as an abnormality in relation to heteronormativity, based on what some version of not just heterosexuality, but mostly its primary basics. When we get to the sort of the LGBT rights conversation, in terms of homonormativity, what we often get is sort of like, well, look, you're just like me. You're also a human being. You just happen to love someone of the same sex, okay? The me being the heteronormative person. Because that's not me. So they're saying to me, oh, you're just like so, right? Okay? You can join our club, all right? So long, and this is Lisa, so we move from Laura Berlant and Michael Warner's understanding of heteronormativity to Lisa Dugan's understanding of homonormativity. That we can normalize some homosexuals or some lesbians or gay people, or the trans almost always drops out. Deed Spade on the LGB fake T, it's an important article to read. But that you're in the club so long as you too want to be a couple of two, and you want to raise kids, and you want to, support the patriotic state, you want to be in the military, you want to consume, these kinds of, and you want to depoliticize that special rights agenda. Okay.
I'm terribly sorry. There's an exam scheduled in this room for 1:30. Are we double booked?
I thought we had to wait till 2, but
Oh. You know, I have about 35 students I'm ready to get.
So I will finish in, in 3
okay.
minutes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
So I want to just finish the answer to this question. So it's about kind of including but not challenging any power structures. White, male, able-bodied, middle class to upper class authority, all of that's still there. And also the perverse homosexual who doesn't want the two-family Homo Normativity is still the scary figure who is a threat to the system. What I do in chapter 5 of the book is do a very close reading of Hillary Clinton's gay rights or human rights speech. And I actually talk about how it relies upon Homo Normativities, but does more than that. I mean, one of the things I think, the last point that we'll close, is that I also think in the age of Trump, and this has always been one of my concerns about the kind of critical commentaries about liberalism. I would rather have liberalism than not have liberalism, okay? And I think that one of the things that I saw happen from the 2000s at least are these queer critiques where liberalism is the worst thing in the world. I would, as somebody who's read as a homosexual, I would rather have rights than not have rights. Okay? I don't get every right because I'm female and I'm not quite cis and all these sorts of things, okay? So I think that we have to be really careful not to just say, oh, Hillary Clinton's gay rights as human rights or the way these things get mobilized are bad because they reproduce existing power structures. They have actually changed a lot of power structures. The world that I grew up in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, bears no resemblance to the world that we have now. And so I think it's very important that we consider these kinds of, these rights conversations about, what's bad about them and what's good about them, and kind of apply our sort of queer logics to those human rights discussions as well. Of course we want liberalism to do better. Of course we want to have inclusion be broader. Of course there are certain power structures that need to be challenged. But my gosh, let's not lose the things that we also have gained. Let's remember what authoritarianism looks like. And let's remember what the UN Security Council could look like in the age of Trump and Marine Le Pen and and on and on. So I think and that's exactly why these are policy issues. Great question. Thank you very much.
I also want to mention that